The night it happened is burned into my memory like the charred remains of my cabins. It was just past midnight when my phone jolted me awake with a call I'll never forget. On the other end was my neighbor, his voice trembling with panic. "Your cabins, they're on fire. You need to get here now." At first I thought I must have misheard him. Fire? My cabins? I stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, trying to make sense of his words. But when I stepped outside, I didn't need an explanation. In the distance, rising above the treetops, was an orange glow that didn't belong in the night sky. My heart dropped into my stomach. My hands shook as I jumped into my truck and sped down the winding road that led to my resort. By the time I arrived, it was too late. Firefighters were already there, hoses blasting water into the inferno, but the flames roared louder than their efforts. My cabins, my pride and joy, my life's work, were engulfed in fire. The wooden beams crackled as they collapsed one by one, sending sparks into the smoky air. The smell of burning pine and cedar stung my nose and coated my throat. My eyes watered, not just from the smoke but from the heartbreak of watching everything I had built reduced to glowing embers. Those cabins weren't just buildings. They carried decades of memories. My grandparents had started this little retreat after the war, carving out a slice of peace in the forest for weary travelers. Over the years, I had rebuilt and expanded them, turning the retreat into a small but beloved resort. Families came here to unplug, to reconnect, to sit under the stars without the noise of the city. My own children had grown up running between those cabins, laughing, playing, leaving behind echoes in the wood that now crackled as it burned. I stood there, helpless, as firefighters fought a losing battle. My fists clenched, nails digging into my palms, rage and grief swirling inside me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, the HOA board members. They stood at the edge of the crowd, whispering to each other, smirking, watching with folded arms as if this were a show put on for their entertainment. Their president, Karen, wore that same smug expression I had seen a dozen times before in meetings. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. 2 weeks earlier, the HOA had cornered me during a community meeting. They wanted me to give up my land, to hand over my cabins so they could demolish them and expand the neighborhood into some sprawling luxury development. They painted it as progress, but I knew what it really was. Greed. They wanted more money, more power, and they didn't care who got crushed in the process. I had stood my ground. I had looked them straight in the eye and said one simple word: no. That no cost me everything. The next day, the fire marshal pulled me aside. He was a kind man who had known my family for years, and though he couldn't say much officially, his eyes told me the truth. "We'll investigate," he said carefully, "but from what I've seen so far, this doesn't look like an accident." I felt my knees weaken. Anger surged through me like a second fire. If the HOA had truly orchestrated this, if they had actually torched my cabins just because I refused to give up my land, then I wasn't just the victim of arson. I was the victim of war. Karen proved my suspicions the very next morning. She showed up on my property, heels clicking against the ash-covered ground. She didn't offer sympathy. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She just stared at the ruins, her arms crossed, and said with a chilling smirk, "This wouldn't have happened if you had just agreed with us." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the smoke of my destroyed legacy. That was the moment something inside me changed. Grief tried to drown me, but rage kept me afloat. I swore to myself that if the HOA thought they could scare me into submission, they were dead wrong. They might have burned down my cabins, but I would burn down their empire, and I wouldn't need fire to do it. I would use something far more powerful: the truth. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my life. Insurance was a nightmare. My family was devastated. Friends tried to comfort me, but nothing they said could fill the void left by those cabins. And yet, through all the sleepless nights, one thought kept me going. I will not let them get away with this. So I started digging. Not in the ashes of my cabins, but in the paper trail the HOA left behind. I attended every meeting, taking notes, asking questions they didn't want me to ask. I filed requests for financial records. I scoured public documents. What started as a desperate attempt to distract myself soon became an obsession. I was looking for something, anything, that could prove just how corrupt they really were. And then I found it. Buried in stacks of financial statements was a pattern of expenses that made my blood boil. Thousands of dollars listed as maintenance that never happened. Community funds spent on luxury dinners, weekend getaways, even spa treatments. And then came the real bombshell. Money quietly funneled into private accounts belonging to Karen and her closest allies on the board. They weren't just corrupt, they were criminals. I stayed up night after night, piecing everything together. Every dollar stolen, every false invoice, every shady signature. My desk became a war room. Papers stacked in piles, red lines connecting names and dates like some crime drama on TV. But this wasn't fiction. This was my life. As the evidence piled up, something inside me hardened. The grief of losing my cabins began to fade, replaced by determination. They thought they had buried me in fire. What they didn't realize was that they had only lit the spark of my revenge. One night, around 3 a.m., I sat back in my chair and stared at the mountain of proof I had gathered. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands trembling from exhaustion, but my heart was steady. I had enough to bring them down. Not just rumors, not just suspicions, solid evidence that would expose them for what they truly were. I whispered to myself, almost like a vow, "You burned my cabins. Now I'm going to burn down your empire with your own budget." That was the night I stopped being a victim. That was the night I became their worst nightmare. The morning of the HOA's monthly meeting, I woke up with a weight in my chest. But it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. For weeks I had worked in silence, building my case like a soldier preparing for war. Today was the day I would strike. The community hall buzzed with the usual chatter as residents filed in, their voices echoing off the walls. Karen sat at the front, draped in her usual smugness, tapping her nails against the wooden table. Her allies flanked her like guards at a throne. To the casual eye, it looked like business as usual. But I knew better. I had brought a storm with me, and they had no idea it was about to break. When the meeting began, Karen wasted no time asserting her dominance. She talked about community unity, about the importance of respect for HOA rules. Her words dripped with irony, but the residents nodded along, too tired or too scared to challenge her. And then came the open floor session, the one time anyone could raise concerns. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady as I stood up. "Farm." Eyes turned toward me. Some looked surprised, others worried. They all knew what I had lost, but none of them knew what I had found. "I have something I'd like to share," I said, holding up a thick binder crammed with papers. "It's about the HOA budget." Karen's smile flickered. Just a fraction, but I saw it. She tried to cover it with a laugh. "Mr. Parker, this isn't the time for personal grievances. If you'd like to discuss your insurance claim—" "This isn't about my insurance," I cut her off, my voice sharp enough to silence the room. "This is about your theft." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen's face flushed crimson, but before she could speak, I opened the binder and started reading aloud. $24,000 listed as maintenance fees for cabin roads that never existed, $12,000 for landscaping, services to a company that doesn't exist, $10,000 spent on a spa weekend for board members. Murmurs erupted. People leaned in, whispering to each other, outrage spreading like fire in dry grass. I didn't stop. Page after page, I laid it all out. The fake invoices, the transfers to personal accounts, the forged signatures. Every detail was documented. Undeniable. Karen tried to interrupt. She banged her gavel, her voice rising in a shrill panic. "This is slander. You can't just—" "Oh, but I can," I snapped, locking eyes with her. "Because these are your signatures, these are your accounts, and this—" I held up a stack of bank statements. "Is proof." The room exploded in chaos. Neighbors shouted, some in disbelief, others in fury. The board members fidgeted, eyes darting like trapped animals. Karen's mask cracked completely, her smug composure replaced with sheer panic. She stammered, trying to form words, but the crowd drowned her out. I waited for the noise to subside before delivering the final blow. And just in case you think, "This is just for show," I said calmly. "Copies of everything have already been sent to the state auditor and the county sheriff's department." Silence fell. Heavy, suffocating silence. Karen's face went pale, her jaw trembling as the weight of my words sank in. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was exposed. For years she had ruled this community with fear, issuing fines, enforcing petty rules, humiliating anyone who stood up to her. But in one night, I had turned the tables. Now it was her turn to answer for her crimes. Neighbors I'd known my whole life came up to me after the meeting, clapping me on the back, thanking me for standing up when no one else dared. Some were in tears, confessing how they had been bullied by the HOA for years. For the first time, the community wasn't afraid of Karen. They were angry at her. And anger, when united, is far stronger than fear. Within days, the investigation was official. Law enforcement moved quickly, seizing records, interviewing board members, freezing accounts. News of the scandal spread like wildfire. Local papers ran headlines about the HOA fraud scandal, and TV stations showed Karen being led out of her home in handcuffs. I'll never forget the look on her face in that moment, the same pale terror she'd worn at the meeting, only this time magnified by the flashing cameras and the weight of justice. The woman who had smirked while my cabins burned was now reduced to a criminal, stripped of her power. But victory didn't come without cost. My cabins were still gone. The land still bore scars of the fire. Some nights I'd stand there in the quiet, staring at the empty foundation, grief washing over me. But then I'd remember the faces of my neighbors, free, smiling, no longer living under the HOA's shadow, and I knew the fight had been worth it. I started rebuilding, slowly but surely. Insurance eventually came through, and friends offered help. Piece by piece, log by log, the cabins began to rise again, and this time they weren't just cabins, they were symbols. Symbols of survival, of resilience, of standing up against those who thought they could take everything from me. The community, too, began to heal. Without Karen's iron grip, people came together in ways I hadn't seen in years. Barbecues, block parties, real conversations instead of whispered complaints. The scars of the fire remained, but they became reminders, not of loss but of what we had overcome together. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky with gold and crimson, I stood in front of the first rebuilt cabin. My son joined me, his hand on my shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "you didn't just rebuild cabins, you rebuilt this community." And maybe he was right. The HOA thought they could break me with fire. Instead, they lit the spark that burned their empire to the ground. Looking back now, I realize the fire that changed everything wasn't just the one that destroyed my cabins. It was the fire that ignited inside me, the fire of defiance, of justice, of resilience. Because in the end, I didn't just lose my cabins, I found my strength. And no HOA, no Karen, no flame could ever take that away.